In 1967, the Vietnam War was in a tense phase, with the U.S. military and allied forces, including the Republic of Vietnam forces and allied countries like South Korea, holding an advantage in terms of numbers and equipment. After several years of fighting, both the U.S. military and the Republic of Vietnam government believed that 1967 would be the decisive year to defeat the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. They hoped to end the war with a major victory, completely eliminating the presence of the South Vietnam Liberation Army and the communist forces from north to south. To achieve this goal, the U.S. planned large-scale operations using tactics of surprise attack and massive military operations to destroy Viet Cong and North Vietnamese military bases in strategic areas around Saigon. One of the main objectives of the operation was to destroy the main regiments of the Liberation Army, creating a strong shock, breaking the enemy's fighting ability, and regaining the initiative in the war. However, while the U.S. military and its allies conducted large-scale operations, they also faced many difficulties, from the strong resistance of the Liberation Army to the inability to break the resolute fighting spirit of the Vietnamese forces, leading to unfortunate failures that the U.S. had to conceal for a long time. Battle of Suoi Ong Than, which took place in October 1967, was one of the fiercest and most decisive battles of the Vietnam War, especially for the U.S. military. The Hungry Regiment of the Liberation Army, led by Colonel Vo Minh Chiet, was suffering from food shortages and had to stop at the Suoi Ong Than area to wait for rice supply deliveries from Logistics Unit 83. The U.S. military discovered traces of the Liberation Army and decided to launch an attack. The 28th Regiment, Black Lion of the U.S. military, was tasked with eliminating the Liberation Army in this area. Although the Liberation Army was suffering from shortages and unprepared for a large-scale battle, they utilized the dense forest terrain and camouflage tactics to set up defense positions. The U.S. forces entered the area on the morning of October 17th, but they were suddenly attacked from 3 directions by Liberation Army forces, with support from Logistics Unit 83. The U.S. military was heavily attacked by rifles, machine guns, claymore mines, and even arrows shot from trees. Despite having superior numbers and modern equipment, the U.S. forces lacked protection and flexible tactics, causing heavy losses. The U.S. Army's Company A was almost completely destroyed, and despite efforts to replace and reinforce their troops, the situation could not be salvaged. Ultimately, the Liberation Army won the Battle of Suoi Ong Than, forcing the U.S. military to retreat in a heavy defeat. During the Battle of Suoi Ong Than, the Liberation Army applied sophisticated concealment tactics and utilized the forest terrain to create a strong defensive advantage. Despite food and troop shortages, they took every opportunity to create a solid defense, preventing the U.S. military from easily advancing. The Suoi Ong Than area had complex terrain with tall trees, dense bushes, and small streams, creating an ideal environment for the Liberation Army to hide and set up individual shelters and trenches, avoiding bombs and creating lookout posts in the trees. When the U.S. forces entered the area on the morning of October 17th, they could not see or hear the enemy nearby, but they found traces of the Liberation Army and began to suspect. Soon after, a series of gunshots rang out from all directions, and the Liberation Army launched a fierce attack, unexpectedly pushing the U.S. forces into a passive position. The U.S. military, accustomed to conventional warfare, was unable to respond effectively to the guerrilla tactics of the Liberation Army. The U.S. Army's companies, especially Company A, were nearly completely destroyed within minutes of the battle beginning. U.S. forces not only suffered heavy losses in manpower, but also faced a lack of effective tactics. Their combat formations lacked adequate protection, and they were attacked from multiple directions, including from the trees, which caused significant casualties. Although the U.S. forces had artillery and air support, due to the difficult terrain and the flexibility of the Liberation Army, this support was ineffective. The U.S. military called for artillery support, but due to internal conflicts and lack of accurate information, coordinating artillery became difficult, further increasing the losses. After more than 2 hours of fierce fighting, the U.S. forces had to retreat with heavy casualties. The losses included many commanding officers, including Colonel Island, and almost the entire Company A was destroyed. They could only retreat when they realized that the Liberation Army was no longer able to resist. Although the U.S. military continued to claim that they had won, in reality, this battle was a heavy defeat for them. After the Battle of Suoyong Than, although the U.S. military suffered heavy losses, the details of this defeat were not widely disclosed, and the truth was concealed for many years. While the U.S. military was defeated in this battle, official reports from the U.S. military and the media described a fictional victory, emphasizing the success of military operations in Vietnam. This was done to maintain the morale of the military and the American public, while preserving the image of an undefeated army in the eyes of the public. The concealment of information about the Battle of Suoyong Than began immediately after the battle ended. U.S. officers and soldiers involved in the battle were not allowed to disclose the truth about their defeat. They could only report what was authorized to be released, and the information related to U.S. military losses was either concealed or distorted. Some reports gave very low damage figures or even omitted any mention of U.S. losses. Commanding officers like Colonel Island, who were killed in the battle, were not mentioned in the reports sent back to the U.S. Instead, the information was adjusted, and exaggerated victories were reported, downplaying the severity of the defeat. U.S. media, especially newspapers and news agencies friendly to the military, blurred the truth about the Battle of Suoyong Than. These newspapers reported that the U.S. military had won, even claiming that the Liberation Army had been almost entirely destroyed, while in reality, it was the U.S. forces who suffered significant losses. This was part of a larger strategy by the U.S. to control war information, creating a strong information front to maintain public trust in the war. The U.S. government and military used the media to amplify their successes while concealing major defeats to prevent confusion and loss of public support. Not only occurred during the war, but also continued after the war ended. For many years after the Vietnam War, the details of the Battle of Suoyong Than and the defeats of the U.S. military were never made public. The truth about the battle was only revealed in 1991, when full reports of the battle were declassified and made available to the public. This marked a turning point in shedding light on the Vietnam War, as the American public first learned of the full and accurate information about the U.S. military's defeat at Suoyong Than. This battle, with the U.S. military's disastrous defeat, had been hidden for too long, but eventually, the truth came to light, marking an important step in understanding the information strategies that the U.S. employed throughout the war. The Battle of Suoyong Than, although its details were hidden for a long time, still provides important lessons about war strategies, the resilience of the Liberation Army, and how the U.S. faced defeat in the Vietnam War. This battle was not only a tactical victory for the Liberation Army, but also a victory of spirit, affirming the resilience and flexibility of the Vietnamese forces in the context of guerrilla warfare. What was important in this battle was the sophisticated defense and camouflage tactics of the Liberation Army. Despite being short on food and weapons, the Liberation Army used the terrain and flexible combat tactics to defeat the U.S. military, a modern and well-equipped army. The Liberation Army's ability to set ambushes, use trees and dense forest terrain to hide, and attack from multiple directions caught the U.S. military off guard and caused significant losses. The U.S. forces not only struggled to cope with guerrilla tactics, but also suffered major losses due to the lack of full support from Allied units and air forces. Furthermore, the Battle of Suoyong Than highlighted the failure of U.S. military strategy when faced with a resilient adversary and flexible tactics. Despite having superior equipment and numbers, the U.S. forces were unable to effectively counter the asymmetric tactics used by the Liberation Army. This also demonstrates the ineffectiveness of conventional warfare when faced with guerrilla warfare, something the U.S. military was not prepared for. The concealment of information about this battle for so long also reflects the U.S. policy of controlling war information. The concealment of defeats and exaggeration of victories was not only meant to maintain the military's morale, but also to ensure public support for the war. However, when information about the Battle of Suoi Ong Than was revealed in 1991, it broke through the information barrier, uncovering the truths about the Vietnam War that had previously been concealed. This marked an important step in clarifying the history of the war and reflecting on the defeats that the U.S. suffered during the Vietnam War.